call came at 2:47 a.m. Steve McQueen didn't answer. He just stared at the phone, ringing in the darkness of his Los Angeles bedroom, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. His wife, Ali, stirred beside him, mumbled something, rolled over. The phone kept ringing. McQueen knew who it was. He'd been waiting for this call for 3 days. Ever since the meeting. Ever since Chicago. Ever since he'd looked a man in the eye. A man whose name you didn't say out loud in certain rooms, and said the one word nobody said to people like that. No. The phone stopped ringing. The silence that followed was somehow louder. McQueen lay there in the dark, eyes open, jaw set, his hand resting on the .45 caliber pistol he now kept in the nightstand. Not because he was afraid. Steve McQueen didn't do afraid, but because when you tell the Chicago outfit to go to hell, you don't sleep quite the same way anymore. Outside, a car drove slowly past his house. Too slowly. The headlights swept across his bedroom ceiling like searchlights. McQueen's hand tightened on the gun. The car kept going. But it would be back. They always came back. That's how it worked when you said no to the mob. They didn't accept it. They tested you, pushed you, waited to see if you'd break. And if you didn't break, they made you disappear. But Steve McQueen had been disappearing people his whole life. Starting with himself. Starting with the scared kid from reform school, who everyone said would end up dead or in prison. Starting with the Marine they called trash. Starting with the actor who'd clawed his way to the top by refusing to be anyone other than exactly who he was. The mob thought they could intimidate him. They thought Hollywood made you soft. They thought fame meant you'd forgotten where you came from. They thought wrong. Because Steve McQueen remembered everything, especially what it felt like to be threatened. And he'd made a promise to himself a long time ago. Nobody threatens me. Not anymore. Not ever again. The phone started ringing again. This time, McQueen picked it up. Didn't say hello. Didn't say anything. Just listened. The voice on the other end was calm, polite even. That made it more terrifying. "Mr. McQueen, you've had some time to reconsider our conversation, have you?" Steve's voice was flat, cold. "No." Silence on the line. Then, a low chuckle. "You're making a mistake. I've made bigger ones. Not like this one." The politeness was gone now. "Do you know what happens to people who disrespect our organization?" McQueen's grip on the phone was white-knuckled, but his voice never wavered. "Do you know what happens to people who threaten me?" Another pause, longer this time. Then, "We'll be seeing you soon, Mr. McQueen." The line went dead. Steve hung up. Checked the gun. Made sure it was loaded. And waited for dawn. If you want to know how a Hollywood legend stared down the most dangerous criminals in America and lived to tell about it, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story is just getting started. 6 months earlier, Steve McQueen was on top of the world. 1971. Le Mans had just wrapped. The Getaway was in pre-production. He was the highest-paid actor in Hollywood, and every studio wanted him. But there was one project that interested him more than all the others combined. A film about the Chicago outfit. The real story. Not some sanitized Hollywood version, but the truth about how organized crime had owned Chicago for decades. About the violence. The corruption. The bodies that disappeared into the Chicago River. About how the mob controlled everything from unions to politics to entertainment. It was the kind of film that could change things, expose things, make people uncomfortable, which is exactly why McQueen wanted to do it. His producer, a tough former newspaperman named Jack Rosen, had set up a meeting in Chicago to scout locations and talk to some connected people who could give them authenticity. Consultants, they called them. People who knew the streets, who knew the stories. What Rosen didn't tell McQueen was that some of those consultants weren't consultants at all. They were the actual people the film would be about. And they weren't happy about it. The meeting was set for a Tuesday night at a restaurant in the Loop called Rossetti's. Italian place. Old school. The kind of restaurant where the back room was always reserved and nobody asked questions about who was meeting there. McQueen flew into O'Hare on a cold November afternoon. The city looked gray and hard under a sky the color of concrete. This was the city he'd been born near, the city his mother had dragged him through as a child, moving from apartment to apartment, man to man, always running from something. He knew these streets. He knew what they could do to you. A car picked him up at the airport. Black Lincoln Continental. Driver didn't talk, just drove. Through the city, past the projects, through neighborhoods where people didn't make eye contact. McQueen watched it all through the tinted windows, his face unreadable behind sunglasses. They pulled up to Rossetti's at 8 p.m. The restaurant looked quiet from the outside. Inside, it was nearly empty. Just a few tables occupied, a bartender wiping glasses, and in the back, behind a red velvet curtain, voices. The hostess, an older woman with too much makeup and eyes that had seen too much, nodded toward the back. "They're waiting for you, Mr. McQueen." He walked through the restaurant alone. Jack Rosen was supposed to be there, but McQueen didn't see him. That should have been the first warning sign. The second was the way everyone in the restaurant stopped what they were doing and watched him walk. Not like fans, like witnesses. He pushed through the curtain. The back room was thick with cigar smoke. 5 men sat around a table covered in red and white checkered cloth, wine glasses, ashtrays. And in the center of the table, a folder. His folder. The script treatment for the film. The man at the head of the table was in his 60s. Impeccably dressed, silver hair slicked back, eyes like a shark, dead and calculating at the same time. He didn't stand when McQueen entered, didn't offer to shake hands, just gestured to an empty chair. "Mr. McQueen, sit." It wasn't a request. Steve remained standing. "Where's Jack?" "Your producer had another engagement. We're here to discuss business. Sit down." McQueen looked at each man in the room. Read them. Street instincts from a lifetime of knowing when you were in danger. These weren't actors. These weren't consultants. These were the real thing. Men who'd killed. Men who'd given orders that ended lives. Men who spoke softly because they never had to raise their voices. He sat. Not because they told him to, but because he wanted to hear what they had to say. The silver-haired man, McQueen would later learn his name was Anthony Giancola, a capo in the Chicago outfit, pushed the script folder across the table. "Interesting reading," Giancola said. "Very detailed, very specific. Names, dates, operations." He took a slow sip of wine. "Where did you get this information, Mr. McQueen?" "Research." "Research." Giancola smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You've researched our organization very thoroughly." "Too thoroughly. It's called authenticity. It's called disrespect." The smile vanished. "You think you can make a movie about us? About our business? Without our permission?" McQueen's jaw tightened. "I don't need permission to make a movie." One of the other men, younger, bigger, with scar tissue around his knuckles, leaned forward. "Maybe you didn't hear him right. He said permission. You need it. Everyone who works in this city needs it." "I don't work in this city. I work in Los Angeles." "You're sitting in our city right now," Giancola said quietly, "and you're planning to tell stories about us. Stories that could be problematic for our interests." McQueen understood what wasn't being said. The film would expose their operations, their political connections, their violence. It would shine a light into corners that needed to stay dark. "So here's what's going to happen," Giancola continued. "You're going to take that script, all copies of it, and you're going to burn them. You're going to cancel this project. You're going to make something else, something that doesn't concern us. And in return, we let you walk out of here. We let you go back to Los Angeles. We let you keep making your movies and living your life. And if I don't?" The room went very quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before violence. Giancola leaned back in his chair, studying McQueen like a specimen. "If you don't, Mr. McQueen, then accidents happen. Cars crash, houses catch fire, people disappear. Hollywood is full of tragic stories. We'd hate for yours to be one of them." He let that sink in, then continued, his voice almost gentle. "We know where you live. We know your wife, your children. We know your schedule, your routines, everything." He paused. "We're not unreasonable men. We're businessmen. And right now, we're offering you a business deal. Walk away from this film, and nobody gets hurt. It's simple." This was the moment that would define everything that came after. Steve McQueen had a choice. He could do what any rational person would do, say yes, walk away, live to fight another day, keep his family safe, keep himself breathing. Or he could do what Steve McQueen always did, what he'd been doing since he was 12 years old and some guard at reform school tried to break him. What he'd done when a Marine sergeant called him trash. What he'd done every time Hollywood tried to tell him how to act, what roles to take, who to be. He could say no. McQueen stood up, slowly. His chair scraped against the floor. Every man in that room tensed. Hands moved toward jackets, toward weapons. The air crackled with potential violence. Steve looked directly at Giancola. His voice was steady, quiet, lethal. "I don't take orders from anyone. I didn't take them in reform school. I didn't take them in the Marines. I don't take them from studio executives. And I sure as hell don't take them from you." Giancola's eyes narrowed. "I'm making the film." McQueen cut him off. "With or without your permission. Because that's what I do. I make films. And nobody, not you, not your organization, not anybody, tells me what I can or can't do." The room erupted. Men stood. Voices raised. One of them, the big one with the scarred knuckles, stepped toward McQueen, hand reaching inside his jacket. Giancola raised one hand. Everything stopped. The big man froze. The room went silent again. Giancola stared at McQueen for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not a friendly laugh. A cold, dangerous laugh that made the other men in the room shift uncomfortably. "You've got balls, McQueen. I'll give you that. But balls don't stop bullets." "Maybe not," Steve said. "But they make for better stories." He turned toward the door, then stopped. Looked back. "And just so we're clear, you threaten me or my family again, you won't need to send anyone. I'll come find you myself." He walked out. Didn't run. Didn't hurry. Just walked through that restaurant like he owned it, past the silent witnesses, out into the cold Chicago night. His heart was hammering. His hands wanted to shake, but he kept them steady. Kept his face stone. Kept moving. Because if you show fear to men like that, you're already dead. The next 72 hours were a nightmare. McQueen flew back to Los Angeles. Hired private security. Armed himself. Told Ali everything. She wanted him to call the police, the FBI, anyone. But McQueen knew better. You don't go to the cops about the mob, not in 1971. Not when the mob owned half the cops. That's when the calls started. The car that drove by his house at night. The men who followed him to the studio. The message was clear. We're watching. We're waiting. Change your mind. But Steve McQueen's mind had been made up a long time ago. Made up in that concrete cell at Boys Republic. Made up in the frozen waters of the Arctic when he saved 5 Marines. Made up every time someone tried to control him and he refused to be controlled. 3 days after the Chicago meeting, something changed. The calls stopped. The surveillance disappeared. The threats evaporated like smoke. McQueen found out why when Jack Rosen showed up at his house, pale and shaking, with a story that seemed impossible. Someone had intervened. Someone high up in organized crime, someone with more power than Giancola, had sent word that McQueen was off limits, untouchable, The reason? Nobody knew for sure. Some said it was because McQueen had served in the Marines and there was an old code about not touching veterans. Some said it was because killing a movie star would bring too much heat. Some said it was simpler than that. McQueen had stood up to them, and in a twisted way, they respected it. But McQueen suspected the real reason was different. He'd called their bluff. He'd shown he wasn't afraid to die. And men like that, men who built their power on fear, didn't know what to do with someone who couldn't be frightened. The film never got made, not because of the mob, but because the studio got cold feet. Too controversial, too risky. But McQueen had made his point. He'd drawn a line. And nobody crossed it. Years later, in 1978, 2 years before his death, Steve McQueen gave a rare interview to a young journalist who asked him about the Chicago incident. By then, most of the men from that room were dead or in prison. Giancola had been shot in 1974 outside a restaurant in Cicero. "They thought Hollywood made me soft," McQueen said, his voice raspy from the cancer that was already growing in his lungs. "They thought fame meant I'd forgotten how to fight. But see, that's the thing people never understood about me." He paused, lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "I never stopped being that kid from reform school. I just got better at hiding it." "Do you regret it?" the journalist asked. "Confronting them like that? You could have been killed." McQueen smiled. A real smile. The kind he rarely gave. "I was already dead before I walked into that room. Dead inside from years of people telling me what I couldn't do, who I couldn't be, what they were offering. To live by bowing down. That wasn't living. That was just a different kind of death." He took a long drag. "At least my way. I gotta stay myself." This story reminds us that courage isn't about not being afraid. Steve McQueen was afraid. He was terrified. But he understood something most people never learn. There are worse things than dying, like living on your knees, like letting fear make your decisions, like becoming what they want you to be instead of who you are. When 5 men in a smoke-filled room in Chicago tried to make him choose between his life and his integrity, Steve McQueen made the only choice he could live with. Not because he was brave, but because he'd spent his entire life building himself into someone who couldn't be broken. And at that point, being broken would have meant destroying everything he'd become. The mob had money, they had power, they had violence. But Steve McQueen had something they couldn't touch. He had himself, and that was the one thing he would never, ever give up. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to be afraid. Sometimes the only way to beat people who want to control you is to show them that there's nothing they can take from you that you're not willing to lose. Sometimes saying no, even when no might get you killed, is the only thing that keeps you alive in the ways that matter. The Chicago outfit learned that lesson the night Steve McQueen walked out of Rossetti's. They learned that some people can't be bought, can't be threatened, can't be controlled. And those people, those rare, stubborn, impossible people, are more dangerous than any organization, any weapon, any threat, because they've already decided they'd rather die than submit. And once someone makes that decision, they're untouchable. If this story reminded you that real power comes from refusing to be controlled, that courage means standing up even when you're terrified, then subscribe. Because every week we're uncovering the moments when legends faced their darkest tests and discovered what they were really made of. Hit that subscribe button. These stories deserve to be remembered, and so does the lesson. Nobody owns you unless you let them.